Welcome to the 28th 2020 NHL Draft recap here at Scouching, and this will be a pretty quick one. And it's a pretty quick one because 3 of the 4 players they drafted were guys that before the draft I had never seen or paid attention to if I had seen them. And when I look at some of the tape that I can find since the draft, I don't know, I'd be surprised if any one of them ended up as NHL players, but I guess it's still too early to tell. At 58, they started by taking Mason Lohrei, and none of the data that I have based on his results so far indicated that he was a player who should have been drafted last year and indicated that he wasn't a player that was really on anyone's radar this season. What put him at 58th overall for the Boston Bruins this season? I don't know. I really don't. I've gone and looked back at some tape. I've asked around with some people whose opinions I respect. I still don't get it. I guess it's still too early to tell, but at 58th overall, there was a litany of players that I would have drafted at that slot over a guy like Mason Lohrei based on what I've seen. I have no expectations for this guy moving forward, but if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I would just be very surprised. At 89th, they drafted Trevor Kuntar. Now, Kuntar is a player who I saw play this year because he did drive really good metrics for a player undrafted last year in the USHL. I like Trevor Kuntar. He's a physical player. He's got some interesting offensive skill for a physical player, and I guess that could take him a ways. At 89th overall, I wouldn't have taken him. Maybe as a late round swing, you bet on the data, but I never came away thinking that Kuntar had the pace or the skill or the speed that really led me to believe that he was too good for the USHL as a D+1. He was a very good USHL player, especially for how big and strong and resilient he is on his feet, with the offensive skill that kind of comes along with his style of play, but I just felt there were better players available at 89 for Boston. But I guess if they feel like there's a match here, I won't complain. At 151st, the director of player development looked at their player list and said, "We're gonna draft my own son in Mason Langenbrunner." Now, Jamie Langenbrunner was a good NHL player and a great leader, and maybe they see the same qualities in his son. But when I looked at his son play hockey this season, I never came away particularly impressed with what I was looking at. I would have liked to see his son play outside of a Minnesota high school situation because he played on Eden Prairie this year, which is usually a powerhouse Minnesota high school team, and he was under a point per game. And even for a defenseman, and even for a September birthday defenseman, to me that doesn't indicate enough of a needle mover. And when I asked around, that opinion was verified by a number of people. It just really struck me as a situation where his dad works for the team, and at 151 they figure he's as good a bet as anyone else, when to me that's a standpoint that I just fundamentally would disagree with. I thought there were still good players available at 151, and players at a similar age range playing against better competition and driving better results. He's big, he shoots right-handed, so I guess we'll see what happens, but this was not a player that I would have had on my list based on what I've seen, even when I look back after the draft's been completed. At 182nd, they finished their draft by again going to the US circuit and taking Riley Duren. I haven't seen a ton of Duren play. He played for a prep school whose video wasn't easily accessible, and from my perspective, he's a fine prep school player. I suppose he's not the worst pick you could possibly make, but again, this caps off a draft for the Boston Bruins where I just look at what they drafted, and similar to last year, I go, I don't know what these players are going to turn into. I don't know what they're really looking for in a hockey player. I just don't really see it. None of these players really are guys that I think are going to be impact players for the Boston Bruins down the road. But for some reason, the Boston Bruins are one of these franchises who just draft whoever and somehow find a way to develop them into NHL players. So maybe that's going to happen with 1, 2, or all 4 of these players, but when I look at their draft class as a whole, I feel very similarly to their class last year and just can't help but feel underwhelmed. First name off their board was Mason Lohrei, and I just didn't see anything that led me to believe that he was one of the 62 best players available last season. So for the Boston Bruins, I'm going to give them a 4C. Again, this is another year where I felt that they had a very weak draft class. They have had a very weak developmental program, at least on paper when I track all 31 teams on paper, but they seem to find guys who can just play in the NHL level, which is I guess the whole point of drafting, especially outside of the first round. And I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens, but again, I'm not overly optimistic. So that's it for the Boston Bruins recap. That's all they did. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, you can click all the buttons you see below me so you never miss another one. If you really liked it, you could subscribe on Patreon or here on YouTube by clicking join below. You get access to a Discord server, early access to videos, data sheets for hundreds of drafted and undrafted prospects, as well as plenty of other goodies. Or you can pick up some merchandise from the Scouchwear shop, where 50% of profits go to the Women's Sports Foundation. So that's all, and we'll see you in the next one when we look at the San Jose Sharks.